There are artists whose careers can be separated from their personal lives, where the music exists in one space and everything else stays in another. Polo G has never really been one of those cases. From the beginning of his rise in Chicago's drill-influenced scene, his story has always carried two parallel tracks. One is the music, which moved quickly from local attention to national recognition. The other is the legal record, which has followed him almost step for step through each stage of that rise. By the time he reached mainstream success, the pattern was already visible. Chart positions climbed, streaming numbers grew, and collaborations expanded. At the same time, arrests, charges, and court proceedings began to appear with increasing regularity. Not always in the same form, and not always with the same outcome, but often close enough together that they started to shape how people read his name in headlines. Born Taurus Tremonti Bartlett in 1999, Polo G grew up in Chicago's Cabrini Green area, a place often referenced in discussions about urban redevelopment, housing struggles, and long-standing cycles of violence and poverty. His early environment became part of his artistic identity, not as decoration, but as a central reference point in his writing. His music reflected emotional weight, personal loss, and the tension between survival and ambition. That foundation mattered because it shaped how his early success was received. When Dire Legend entered the Billboard charts in 2019, it was not just seen as another debut album. It was framed as the arrival of a voice that could translate personal experience into commercial success without losing emotional clarity. The follow-up projects reinforced that perception, especially as his 2021 album reached #1 on the Billboard 200 and produced one of the biggest singles of that year. But even at that point, the legal side of his life was already beginning to surface in public reporting. In June 2021, shortly after a high-profile album release period in Miami, Polo G was arrested following an incident involving law enforcement. Charges included battery on a police officer, resisting arrest, and other related offenses. The details varied depending on reporting, but the structure of the case remained consistent: an altercation during a stop, escalation, and multiple charges being filed. What stood out was not only the arrest itself, but what followed it. Instead of progressing into a long court battle or sentencing outcome, the case moved into a diversion program. By late 2021, he had entered a pre-trial agreement that would allow certain charges to be dropped upon completion. This outcome introduced a pattern that would later repeat: serious allegations, structured legal response, and resolution without long-term conviction. From that point forward, the public perception of Polo G began to split in two directions. One interpretation saw a young artist repeatedly involved in situations that placed him at legal risk, relying on legal strategy and representation to avoid lasting consequences. The other interpretation focused on context, arguing that increased visibility, policing patterns, and industry pressure created conditions where incidents involving artists like him were more likely to escalate into legal cases. Neither interpretation fully disappeared. Instead, they began to coexist. As his career continued to grow, the legal cycle did not slow down. Instead, it expanded into different cities and different types of incidents. Each case added another layer to an already complicated public image, where success and scrutiny were no longer separate conversations. The turning point in how people discussed him was not a single event, but the accumulation of multiple arrests and case dismissals within a relatively short period of time. It created a structure where every new development was read in relation to the previous one, rather than as an isolated incident. And that is where the story begins to shift from early success into a longer, more complicated phase, where legal pressure, career momentum, and public perception start to operate in the same space. By the time Polo G's legal situation moved beyond the first Miami case, the conversation around him had already begun to shift. What was once viewed as isolated incidents connected to fame, pressure, or environment slowly started to look like a repeating pattern, not in a way that could be reduced to a single explanation, but in a way that made each new development harder to ignore. After the 2021 Miami arrest and the diversion outcome, attention briefly returned to music. He continued releasing projects, performing, and maintaining commercial visibility. But the legal side of his life did not fade. Instead, it reappeared in different locations, under different circumstances, each time adding another layer to an already expanding record. The most significant escalation came in August 2023, when law enforcement carried out a search at a shared residence in Chatsworth, California. During that operation, Polo G and his brother, who also records music under the name Trench Baby, were taken into custody. Firearms were reportedly recovered from the property, and both individuals were booked on multiple charges tied to weapons possession and alleged violent incidents linked to earlier reports. What made this moment different from earlier arrests was the structure around it. It was not a single stop or a brief encounter. It involved a coordinated search, multiple agencies, and overlapping allegations that extended beyond one incident in time. The charges included serious accusations, and bail was set at a level that reflected the weight of the case. Public reaction at this stage became more divided. Some observers saw a continuation of a familiar pattern, legal issues escalating alongside fame, with each case eventually being reduced or dismissed through legal process. Others saw something more consistent developing, where repeated encounters with law enforcement suggested deeper instability that was not being addressed by short-term legal outcomes. Legal representation played a central role in how these cases unfolded. His attorney, Bradford Cohen, became a consistent figure in public statements, often arguing that the charges were either misrepresented, insufficiently supported, or based on circumstances that did not reflect direct involvement by Polo G himself. This legal framing became part of the wider public interpretation, because every time a case emerged, there was also an immediate counter-narrative suggesting that the situation was either overcharged or not fully representative of the facts. That tension between legal process and public perception became a defining feature of his career outside music. In April 2024, another incident added to the growing file. Police were called to a hotel in New York after a firearm was discovered in a room associated with Polo G. Reports indicated that a loaded handgun was found, leading to his arrest and later release on bail while the case moved through the court system. Unlike earlier cases, this one was tied to a very clear physical discovery rather than a broader dispute or incident involving multiple accounts. That made public interpretation even more divided. Some focused on the legal presumption of innocence, while others pointed to the recurring nature of similar allegations across different cities. By late 2024, that New York case was ultimately dismissed and sealed, bringing another legal episode to a conclusion without a conviction. However, the pattern itself remained unchanged. Shortly after, another arrest occurred in Los Angeles in October 2024, this time involving allegations of concealed weapon possession during a traffic stop. The timing of this incident was notable because it came just before the start of a scheduled tour, adding a professional consequence to an already ongoing legal situation. Even though records later indicated insufficient grounds for a criminal complaint and he was released without bail, the repetition of similar legal categories, primarily weapon-related charges, began to shape how audiences interpreted the broader pattern. At this stage, the discussion around Polo G was no longer only about individual cases. It had become about frequency. Each incident, regardless of outcome, added to a cumulative perception that was difficult to reset. Even when charges were dropped or dismissed, the existence of the arrest itself remained part of the public archive. And that archive, is what leads into the final layer of the story, where the focus shifts from legal outcomes to what this cycle means for the balance between career momentum and personal risk. By the time Polo G's legal timeline entered its later stage, the most important shift was no longer about what happened in each individual case. It was about how all of those cases began to sit on top of each other in the public record. Even when outcomes differed, the repetition created a sense of continuity that shaped how every new development was received. The New York arrest in April 2024 became a key reference point in that cycle. A firearm was reportedly discovered in a hotel room linked to him, leading to charges and a period of legal uncertainty while the case moved through the courts. That incident followed a similar structure to earlier cases: arrest, legal process, public discussion, and eventual legal resolution. By December 2024, that case was dismissed and sealed, removing the legal consequences in court terms. But even with dismissal, the public record of the arrest itself remained part of the broader narrative that had already formed over several years. This is where the situation becomes more complex than a simple legal timeline, because in most systems, the difference between charged and convicted is very clear. But in public perception, that difference is often compressed. An arrest becomes a headline becomes a reference point, and repeated reference points begin to form a story that exists independently of court outcomes. That is exactly what happened here. Each case involving Polo G had its own legal structure, its own evidence standards, and its own procedural outcome. Some ended in dismissal, others in diversion, and some remained unresolved for periods of time before moving forward. But the repetition of similar categories of charges, particularly weapons-related allegations, meant that the public narrative did not reset after each conclusion. Instead, it accumulated. By late 2024, another Los Angeles arrest added to that accumulation, occurring just days before a major touring schedule. Although he was released without bail after authorities determined there was insufficient basis for charges, the timing reinforced the perception that legal issues were closely running alongside professional obligations. This overlap between legal proceedings and career activity became one of the defining tensions of his public life. On one side, there was a working artist continuing to release music, tour, and collaborate at a high level. On the other side, there was a recurring legal pattern that repeatedly placed him in court systems across multiple jurisdictions. Both realities existed at the same time. The challenge for public interpretation is that neither side fully cancels the other. Supporters often point to the fact that multiple cases have ended without conviction, emphasizing due process, legal representation, and the importance of not equating arrest with guilt. Critics focus instead on repetition, arguing that regardless of outcome, the frequency of incidents suggests unresolved behavioral or environmental issues that continue to surface in different forms. Neither interpretation is fully complete on its own. What is clear is that the legal history and the musical career are now intertwined in a way that cannot easily be separated. Every new release, every chart placement, and every collaboration exists alongside a public memory of prior arrests and court appearances. Even the reception of his music has been influenced by this backdrop. Projects that would normally be discussed purely in terms of production, lyrics, or chart performance are often analyzed in relation to his personal circumstances. That creates a situation where the art is no longer consumed in isolation from the artist's legal history. At the same time, the music itself continues to perform commercially and maintain a dedicated audience base. That persistence is important because it shows that public controversy does not automatically erase artistic relevance. Instead, it creates a dual perception, one of ongoing success and one of ongoing instability. As of the most recent period covered in available reporting, at least one legal matter remained unresolved into late 2025, extending the timeline of active legal engagement across multiple years. That ongoing status means the story is not closed in a legal sense, but it is also not static in a cultural sense. It continues to evolve through new releases, public appearances, and periodic updates. In the end, the central question around Polo G is not only about what happened in each case, but about how long a career can maintain momentum while repeatedly intersecting with legal systems in different cities. Because over time, it stops being a series of separate events. It becomes a pattern. And once a pattern forms in public life, it tends to define perception long after individual outcomes have been resolved in court.